In the land of the rising sun, a kingdom known as Cathay remained unconquered by the Mongols. This was the first time the travellers had heard of such a place. They learned of it from a friar named William Ruysbroek, also known as Rubruquis, who visited Karakoram as an ambassador from St. Louis. He returned to Europe in 1255 and shared some of his information with Roger Bacon. According to Rubruquis, the Cathayans were small, spoke through their noses, and had narrow eyes like many Eastern people. The currency of Cathay consisted of pieces of cotton paper, about the size of a palm, with lines printed on them resembling the seal of Mangu Khan. They wrote with a pencil, and a single character could represent several letters to form a whole word. Rubruquis identified the Cathayans with the Series of ancient times, who were known for producing silk. Ptolemy had heard of the sign, but failed to identify the two. Some believe that the name China came from a Malay modification during a sea voyage, while the names Ceres and Cathayans came overland and caused confusion. Other Franciscans followed in the footsteps of Rubruquis, including John of Montecorvino, who settled in Canbalig, imperial city, or Pekin as archbishop, and Friar Odoric of Pordenone, who travelled in India and China between 1316 and 1330. Odoric brought back an account of his voyage filled with marvellous stories, most of which were taken into the work attributed to Sir John Maundeville. However, the knowledge brought back by these wandering friars paled in comparison to the extensive and accurate knowledge of almost the entire Eastern Asia brought back to Europe by Marco Polo, a Venetian who spent 18 years of his life in the East. His travels were an epoch in the history of geographical discovery, second only to the voyages of Columbus. In 1260, two of his uncles, by the names of Niccolo and Maffeo Polo, set forth from Constantinople on a trading venture to the Crimean Peninsula. But their journey did not end there, for they were led to visit Bokhara, and then to the court of the great Khan, Kublai. The Khan received them with great hospitality and was impressed with the desirability of introducing Western civilization into the new Mongolian Empire. He entrusted them with a message to the Pope, demanding 100 wise men of the West to teach the Mongolians the Christian religion and Western arts. The two brothers returned to their native place, Venice, in 1269, but found no pope to comply with the great Khan's request. Clement IV had died the year before, and his successor had not yet been appointed. They waited for a couple of years until Gregory X was elected, but he only meagerly responded to the great Khan's demands. He instructed two Dominicans to accompany the Polos, who on this occasion took with them their young nephew Marco, a lad of 17. They started in November 1271, but soon lost the company of the Dominicans, who lost heart and went back. They went first to Ormuz, at the mouth of the Persian Gulf, then struck northward through Khorasan Balkh to the Oxus, and thence onto the plateau of Pamir. Thence they passed the great desert of Gobi, and at last reached Kublai in May 1275, at his summer residence in Kaipingfu. Despite the fact that they had not carried out his request, the Khan received them in a friendly manner, and was especially taken by Marco, whom he took into his own service. A record was found in the Chinese annals, stating that in the year 1277, a certain Polo was nominated as a second-class commissioner of the Privy Council. His duty was to travel on various missions to eastern Tibet, to Cochin China, and even to India. The Polos amassed much wealth owing to the Khan's favour, but found him very unwilling to let them return to Europe. Marco Polo held several important posts. For 3 years he was governor of the great city of Yanchao, and it seemed likely that he would die in the service of Kublai Khan. By a stroke of good fortune, they were finally able to return to Europe. The Khan of Persia wished to marry a princess from the great Khan's family, to whom he was related. Since the young lady chosen could not be expected to endure the hardships of an overland journey from China to Persia, it was decided to send her by sea around the coast of Asia. The Tatars were not skilled navigators, and the Polos were granted permission to accompany the young princess on the rather dangerous voyage. They departed in 1292 from Zayton, a port in Fujian, and after a journey of over 2 years around the southern coast of Asia, they safely delivered the lady to her intended home, though she eventually married the son instead of the father, who had died in the meantime. They said goodbye and travelled through Persia to their own home, which they reached in 1295. When they arrived at the Polos' ancestral estate, dressed in their coarse Tatar garments, their relatives initially refused to believe that they were the long-lost merchants. However, the Polos invited them to a feast, during which they dressed in their finest attire and changed outfits for every course, giving their discarded clothes to the servants. At the end of the banquet, they brought out their shabby garments and, taking sharp knives, began to rip open the seams, revealing vast quantities of rubies, sapphires, carbuncles, diamonds, and emeralds, which they had converted most of their possessions into. This display naturally altered the nature of their welcome from their relatives, who were then eager to hear how they had acquired such wealth. In describing the riches of the great Khan, Marco Polo, who was the primary spokesperson for the group, had to use the term million to express the extent of his wealth and the number of people he governed. This was considered a standard traveller's tale, and Marco Polo was commonly known among his acquaintances as Messer Marco Million. In the days of Marco Polo, his stories were not well received, but in the year he arrived in Venice, a war broke out between Genoa and the Queen of the Adriatic. Marco Polo was captured and thrown into prison in Genoa, where he met Rusticano of Pisa, a learned man who rewrote many romances in French. While in prison, Rusticano wrote down Marco Polo's narrative in French, preserving it for all time. Marco Polo was released in 1299 and returned to Venice, where he died on January the 9th, 1334. It is impossible to adequately describe the importance of Marco Polo's travels and their significance in the history of geographical discovery. Colonel Sir Henry Yule's edition of Marco Polo's Travels is a great monument of English learning and provides a summary of his claims. He was the first adventurer to traverse the entire length of Asia, naming and describing each kingdom he encountered with his own eyes. He spoke of the deserts of Persia, the blooming plateaus and rugged gorges of Badakhshan, the jade-filled rivers of Khotan, the Mongolian steppes, the birthplace of the power that had recently threatened to engulf Christendom, and the new and dazzling court established by Cambaluc. He was the first to reveal China in all its wealth and vastness, with its enormous rivers, massive cities, rich manufacturing, teeming population, and unbelievably vast fleets that sailed its seas and inland waters. He told of the nations on its borders, with their peculiarities of customs and worship, of Tibet, with its squalid devotees, of Burma, with its golden pagodas and tinkling crowns, of Laos, of Siam, of Cochin China, of Japan, the eastern Thule, with its rosy pearls and golden-roofed palaces. He was the first to speak of the Museum of Beauty and Wonder, the Indian archipelago, the source of those highly prized aromatics, whose origin was so obscure, of Java, the pearl of the islands, of Sumatra, with its many kings, its peculiar costly products, and its cannibalistic tribes, of the naked natives of Nicobar and Andaman, of Ceylon, the island of gems, with its sacred mountain and Adam's tomb, of India the Great, not as a land of mythical tales, but as a country explored and seen first-hand, with its virtuous Brahmins, its obscene ascetics, its diamonds, and the strange stories of their acquisition, its pearl-filled seabeds, and its powerful sun. He was the first in medieval times to give a clear account of the secluded Christian empire of Abyssinia and the semi-Christian island of Socotra. He spoke, albeit dimly, of Zanzibar, with its black population and ivory, and of the vast and remote Madagascar, bordering on the dark ocean of the south, with its rook and other monstrous creatures, and, in a distant and opposite region, of Siberia and the Arctic Ocean, of dog-sleds, white bears, and reindeer-riding tunguses. Marco Polo, one of the greatest names in the history of geography, may have added more to our knowledge of the Earth's surface than any other traveller. Until Mr. Stanley's time, no man had visited so many places previously unknown to civilized Europe. Although the lands he discovered were already fully populated, they soon fell into disorder and were closed to any civilizing influences. For a long time, nothing followed from these discoveries, and his accounts were received with incredulity. He himself was regarded more as Marco Milione than as Marco Polo. While Marco Polo's travels were extensive, they were exceeded in extent, though not in variety, by those of the greatest of Arabian travellers, Muhammad ibn Battuta. Born in Tangier, he began his travels in 1334 as part of the ordinary duty of a good Mohammedan to visit the holy city of Mecca. While at Alexandria, he met a learned sage named Borhan Eddin, to whom he expressed his desire to travel. Borhan told him to visit his brothers in Sindhia and China and present his compliments to them. Owing mainly to the fact that the Tatar princes had adopted Islamism instead of Christianity, Ibn Battuta was ultimately enabled to greet all three brothers of Borhan Eddin. He even conveyed the greetings of the Sheikh Kawan Eddin, whom he met in China, to a relative of his residing in the Sudan. During his 30 years of travels, Ibn Battuta visited the Holy Land, Armenia, the Crimea, Constantinople, which he visited in company with a Greek princess who married one of the Tatar Khans, Bokhara, Afghanistan, and Delhi. Here he found favor with the Emperor Muhammad Inglak, who appointed him a judge and sent him on an embassy to China. At first he traveled overland, but this route was found to be too dangerous. He ultimately went from Calicut, via Ceylon, the Maldives, and Sumatra, to Zaitun, then the great port of China. The civil war had erupted, and he retraced his steps back to Calicut, but he didn't dare to face the emperor. He continued on to Ormuz and Mecca, and eventually returned to Tangier in 1349. However, his thirst for travel was still unquenched. He embarked on a journey to Spain and made his way through Morocco, across the Sahara, and into the Sudan. He traveled along the Niger River, which he mistook for the Nile, and even visited Timbuktu. It wasn't until 1353, 28 years after he had set out on his adventures, that he finally returned to Fez. His accounts of his travels were primarily focused on showcasing the widespread influence of Islam during his time and how it facilitated extensive travel. However, his writings were in Arabic and had no impact on European knowledge, which had little to gain from him after Marco Polo, except for information on the Sudan. With him, the history of medieval geography could be considered to have ended, as Prince Henry the Navigator's activity began within 80 years of his death, marking the start of the modern era. Meanwhile, India had become slightly more familiar, mainly due to the journeys of wandering friars who visited it primarily to pay homage to the shrine of St. Thomas, who was believed to have been martyred in India. It's also worth noting the early spread of the Nestorian Church throughout Central Asia. As early as the 7th century, Syrian Christians who followed the teachings of Nestorius began spreading them eastward, establishing bishoprics in Persia and Turkestan, and eventually expanding as far as Beijing. Their missionary activity experienced a certain resurgence under the Mongol Khans, but the limited language in which their reports were written prevented them from having any significant impact on geographical knowledge, except in one particular area, which is of some interest: the Lost Ten. Tribes of Israel have always sparked interest, and a legend emerged that they had converted to Christianity and lived in the East under a king who was also a priest, known as Prester John. Reports brought by Nestorian priests stated that a Mongol prince named Ung Khan had adopted Christianity, and in Syriac this sounded like John the Cohen, or priest, leading to the identification of Ung Khan as the Prester John of legend. Travelers sought to discover this Christian kingdom in the East for a long time. However, it was later discovered that such a Christian kingdom existed in Abyssinia. Due to the erroneous views of Ptolemy followed by the Arabs, Abyssinia was considered to extend towards farther India, leading to the identification of the land of Prester John in Abyssinia. This error helped the progress of geographical discovery, as we shall see later on. The medieval travels added mainly a wider extent of land in China and the archipelago of Japan, or Chipangu, to the map of the world. The accompanying map displays the various travels and voyages of importance, enabling the reader to understand how students of geography, who added to Ptolemy's estimate of the extent of the world east and west the new knowledge acquired by Marco Polo, would still further decrease the distance westward between Europe and Chipangu, preparing men for the voyage of Columbus. Chapter 5. Roads and Commerce. We have traversed ancient times and the Middle Ages, arriving at the threshold of the great discoveries of the 15th and 16th centuries. We have provided a rough outline of what humankind had learned about the Earth during that long period, and how they acquired that knowledge. However, we still need to delve into how they obtained this knowledge and why they sought it. To some extent, we may have answered the latter question when discussing the progress of conquest. But men did not conquer solely for the sake of conquest. We must also consider the material advantages that come with warfare. Furthermore, when men embark on their voyages of discovery, they must traverse paths already beaten by the natives of the lands they intend to conquer. Often, after succeeding in warfare, they must establish new and more suitable means of communication to consolidate their rule. In short, we must explore the roads of the ancient and medieval worlds, and the commerce for which those roads were primarily used. For our purposes, a road can be most easily defined as the most convenient means of communication between two towns. Logically, this implies that towns existed before the roads were constructed. When investigating specific roads, it is necessary to begin by examining why people established their dwellings in certain locations. Initially, people gathered for defensive purposes, and the earliest towns were those that could be easily defended due to their natural position, such as Athens or Jerusalem. Additionally, religious motives often influenced the establishment of towns, and settlements would form around temples or cloisters. However, soon, considerations of easy accessibility became the primary factor in the choice of settlements. For this reason, towns located on rivers, especially at fords, such as Westminster, or in well-protected harbours like Naples, or in the centre of a district, such as Nuremberg or Vienna, became the most convenient places for the exchange of goods. On both rivers and the shores of the sea, ships and boats were the primary means of communication in early times. However, as towns were established, it became necessary to connect them with land routes, which were determined by the lay of the land. Mountains often required large detours, such as around the Pyrenees, while rivers necessitated the search for fords and the construction of new towns at convenient crossing points. Once a recognized route was established, people tended to stick to it, even if a better option became available. Water communication played a crucial role in determining the location of towns in ancient times. Towns situated in the corners of bays, like Archangel, Riga, Venice, Genoa, Naples, Tunis, Bassora, and Calcutta, naturally became centers of trade for the bay. On rivers, towns were often located at the end of tides, such as London, or at prominent bends in the stream, or junctions with tributaries like Koblenz or Khartoum. Important towns were typically found at both ends of a peninsula, like Hamburg and Lübeck, or Venice and Genoa. However, for naval purposes, it was desirable to have a station at the head of the peninsula to command both arms of the sea, as seen at Cherbourg, Sevastopol, or Gibraltar. Roads could then be easily constructed across the base of the peninsula and to its extreme point. Initially, inhabitants of any given town viewed those from other towns as enemies. However, over time they found it convenient to exchange some of their surplus goods with their neighbors, and trade began. Markets became neutral ground, where mutual animosities were temporarily set aside for the common good. Often, localities on the border between two states were chosen as places for the exchange of goods, ultimately leading to the creation of new towns. As trade increased, the once inaccessible fortress towns on high ground were abandoned for settlements in the valleys or by the riversides. Roads naturally followed these routes, but for military purposes it was sometimes necessary to depart from the valley paths. The Romans, however, paid no heed to these requirements. The earliest form of international communication was by sea, pioneered by the Phoenicians. They established neutral trading grounds along the Mediterranean coast, and the Greeks followed suit in the Aegean and Black Seas. But caravans also played a significant role, with routes established between Egypt, Syria, and Mesopotamia, later extending into farther Asia. In Europe, the Romans were the great road builders. Rome's central position in Italy and the Mediterranean made it accessible from the sea and easily defensible. The Latium Plain's central location made it the natural hub for Latin traders. The Romans needed to make themselves accessible to the rest of Italy, and so began building their remarkable roads, many of which still stand today. Building is the right word, for a Roman road is essentially a broad wall built in a deep ditch, rising above the surface. This solid substructure could withstand heavy traffic, and traces of these roads can still be found throughout Europe, almost 2,000 years later. As the Roman Empire expanded, these roads became a crucial means of preserving their conquests. By placing a legion in a central location where many of these roads converged, they could strike quickly in any direction and overawe the country. Stations were built along the roads of the ancient Romans, and even today many of Europe's main highways follow the same paths. Our modern civilization owes much to this network of roads, and we can see a clear difference in the culture of nations where such roads never existed, like Russia and Hungary, compared to the western part of Europe, where they were the primary means of communication. Only in the vicinity of these highways could one obtain the most complete information about the location of towns and the divisions of peoples. A map of the major Roman roads of antiquity, like the one already presented, also provides a framework for the geographical knowledge summarized in Ptolemy's great work. But even more important for the future development of geographical knowledge were the great caravan routes of Asia, which we must now consider. Asia is a continent of plateaus that culminate in the Pamir Steppes, appropriately called by their inhabitants the roof of the world. To the east of these steppes, 4 great mountain ranges run roughly along the same latitudes, the Himalayas to the south, and the Kuen-Lun, Tian Shan, and Altai to the north. Between the Himalayas and the Kuen-Lun lies the great plateau of Tibet, which ends in a sort of cul-de-sac in Kashmir. Between the Kuen-Lun and the Tian Shan is the Gobi Steppe of Mongolia, running west of Kashgar and Yarkand. Meanwhile, between the Tian Shan and the Altai lies the great Kyrgyz steppe. It is evident that only 2 routes are possible between eastern and western Asia, one between the Kuen-Lun and the Tian Shan via Kashgar and Bokhara, and the other south of the Altai, skirting the north of the Great Lakes Balkhash, Aral, and Caspian, and then to the south of Russia. The former would lead to Bassora or Ormuz, and then by sea or overland around Arabia to Alexandria. The latter and longer route would reach Europe via Constantinople. Communication between southern Asia and Europe was primarily by sea, taking advantage of the monsoons from Sri Lanka to Aden and then through the Red Sea. Alexandria, Basra, and Hormuz were the main centers of eastern trade, while communication with the Mongols or China would go along the 2 routes mentioned above, which have existed throughout history. These routes were used by medieval travelers to Cathay, such as the Polos. However, China could also be reached by sea, as Marco Polo's travels showed. In the late Middle Ages, when the Mongol Empire broke up and traffic through Central Asia was not secure, communication with the East was via Alexandria. It is important to realize how much Europe depended on the East for most of the luxuries of life after the Crusades. Nothing produced by the looms of Europe could equal the silk of China, the calico of India, or the muslin of Mosul. The chief gems that decorated the crowns of kings and nobles, such as emeralds, topazes, rubies, and diamonds, all came from the East, mainly from India. The whole of medieval medical science was derived from the Arabs, who obtained most of their drugs from Arabia or India. Even for the incense that burned on the countless altars of Roman Catholic Europe, merchants had to seek the materials in the Levant. For many of the more refined handicrafts, artists had to seek their best material from Eastern traders, such as shellac for varnish or mastic for artists' colors, gamboge from Cambodia, ultramarine from lapis lazuli. Under medieval circumstances, it was often necessary to use musk or opoponax of the East to counteract the odors resulting from the bad sanitary habits of the West. But above all, Europeans were dependent on the spices of the Asiatic islands for the condiments that were almost necessary for health, and certainly desirable for seasoning the salted food of winter and the salted fish of Lent. In Hakluyt's great work on English voyages and navigations, he gives a list of the places from which the chief staples of the Eastern trade came, written out by an Aleppo merchant, William Barrett, in 1584. From the islands of Malucco, Taranate, and Amboyna, as well as Java, came the fragrant cloves that perfumed the homes of the wealthy. The nutmegs of Banda added flavor to dishes, while maces from Banda, Java, and Malacca were used for their medicinal properties. Pepper common from Malabar added a spicy kick to meals, and cinnamon from Ceylon was a popular ingredient in desserts. During the Middle Ages, these luxuries and even necessities were mainly traded by the Arabs, who had a virtual monopoly of the market. Europe had little to offer in exchange except for their gold and silver coins, resulting in a constant outflow of precious metals from west to east. This made the sultans and caliphs increasingly wealthy, culminating in the opulence of Solomon the Magnificent. Alexandria was the hub of this trade, and many European nations established factories in the city to protect the interests of their merchants seeking Eastern luxuries. Benjamin of Tudela, a Jewish traveler who visited Alexandria in 1172, described it as a bustling city that attracted people from all over the world, including Valencia, Tuscany, India, Mesopotamia, Syria, Greece, and Turkey. The city was full of merchants seeking to buy all sorts of spices from India, which were then sold to Christian merchants. The Italians had the shortest distance to travel to reach Alexandria, and by the end of the 13th century they had taken over the eastern trade. Amalfi and Pisa were initially the main ports, but Genoa and Venice soon became the dominant players due to their favorable location. Genoa and Venice competed for the monopoly of the trade, but Venice had a more direct route, leaving Genoa to focus on trade with Constantinople and the northern overland route from China. From Venice, the exotic spices, precious jewels, alluring perfumes, and luxurious fabrics of the East were transported northward through Augsburg and Nuremberg to Antwerp, Bruges, and the Hanseatic League, who paid for them with the wealth they had amassed from their thriving fishing and textile industries. England, too, sent her wool to Italy, in exchange for the tantalizing flavors and fragrances of the East. The immense wealth and influence of Venice were almost entirely derived from her monopoly on the highly profitable Eastern trade. By the 15th century, she had expanded her territories along the lower Po Valley, into Dalmatia, parts of the Morea and Crete, ultimately acquiring Cyprus in 1489, thereby establishing a chain of outposts all the way from Aleppo or Alexandria to the northern Adriatic. However, just as Venice appeared to have reached the pinnacle of her prosperity, with the Aldi family as Europe's leading printers and the Bellini brothers ushering in the great Venetian school of painting, a formidable rival emerged on the horizon. This rival had been quietly developing a revolutionary approach to competing in the Eastern trade for nearly the entire 15th century. And with the advent of this new method, the great era of modern geographical exploration began. Chapter 6. To the Indies. In olden times, the folks of the Iberian Peninsula were preoccupied with pushing back the tide of the Mohammedan conquest, which had spread throughout the land since 711. It was not until 1492, a year of great significance in history and geography, that the last sigh of the Moor in Spain was heard. However, Portugal, situated on the western side of the peninsula, had already rid itself of the Moors over 200 years prior, though it struggled to maintain its independence from the neighboring kingdom of Castile. King Juan of Castile attempted to conquer Portugal, but was thwarted by João, a natural son of the previous king of Portugal. In 1385, João became king and freed Portugal from any danger on the side of Castile by winning the Battle of Aljubarrota. He married Philippa, daughter of John of Gaunt, and their third son, Henry, would go on to revolutionize people's understanding of the inhabited globe. Henry first displayed his prowess in the capture of Ceuta, located opposite Gibraltar, during the Battle of Agincourt in 1415. This was the first time the Portuguese flag was planted on the Moorish coast. It is possible that this encounter with the Moors inspired Prince Henry to consider establishing similar factory fortresses among the Mussulmans of India. Whatever the cause, he began to devote all his thoughts and attention, from around 1418, to the possibility of reaching India through alternative routes. To this end, he established himself on the rocky promontory of Sagres, one of the westernmost points on the continent of Europe. Here, he set up an observatory and a seminary for the training of theoretical and practical navigators. He summoned astronomers, cartographers, and skilled seamen, while having sturdier and larger vessels built specifically for exploration. He improved the astrolabe, the predecessor to the modern sextant, which allowed for the determination of latitude with some accuracy. Additionally, he equipped all his ships with a compass, which entirely determined their steering. From Majorca, the center of practical map-making in the 14th century, Prince Henry brought a skilled navigator and map-maker named Mestre Jacme. With his help, and that of others, the prince studied the possibility of a sea voyage to India around the coast of Africa. Ptolemy had left the extent of Africa to the south undefined, but Eratosthenes and many Roman geographers assumed that the coast of Africa made a semicircular sweep from the right horn of Africa, just south of the Red Sea, to the northwestern shore near what we now call Morocco. If this were true, the voyage along this sweep of shore would be even shorter than the voyage through the Mediterranean and Red Seas, and there would be no need to disembark at the Isthmus of Suez. These writers assumed another continent south of Africa, which was in the torrid zone and completely uninhabitable. In Prince Henry's time, the northwest coast of Africa was known as far as Cape Boyador. Norman sailors had already advanced beyond Cape Non or Nun, which was so named because it was believed that nothing existed beyond it. Prince Henry had to solve the problems of whether the coast of Africa trended sharply to the east after Cape Boyador, and whether the ideas of the ancients about the uninhabitability of the torrid zone were justified by fact. He attempted to solve these problems by sending out expeditions down the northwest coast of Africa each year, each of which penetrated farther than its predecessor. Almost at the beginning he was rewarded by the discovery or rediscovery of Madeira in 1420 by João Gonçalves Zarco, one of the squires of his household. For some time he was content with occupying this and the neighbouring island of Porto Santo, which, however, was ruined by the rabbits let loose upon it.